Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. Hope you're doing well. Now I got another History Reacts video for you today, so this is once again from the Oversimplified channel, which to be honest I'm becoming a bit too reliant on. This is Henry VIII, who is an absolutely fascinating historical figure. Very important of course in English history, started the English Reformation, which set England on the road from leaving Catholicism to becoming a Protestant country. Of course this was later spread all around the globe by the British Empire. And really did all that without really planning to. He didn't break with Rome because of some great theological dispute, but because he had fallings out with his wife, with the Pope, with the Holy Roman Emperor, and because he wanted a son. So it's a crazy set of circumstances that led to one of the biggest religious ruptures in European history. So without any more of me wasting your time, let's get on and watch the video.
This video was made possible by Honey. Keep watching to find out how you can save money when you shop online.
Nice.
Also, the reviews are in. That's some nice merch. Get your brand new character pin, limited time face mask, and more. Link down below.
I would of course put a link to the original video in the description via which you can go and buy this fantastic merch, which I fully endorse. Admittedly I've never bought any myself, but I fully endorse it.
Blah. Sigmund, I don't have much longer. Tell me, was I a good king?
Yeah.
Okay. Will I be remembered as the great warrior king who invaded France, revolutionized English healthcare, and developed great parklands? Probably not.
No.
Because of the wife killing.
Yes.
Because of the wife killings.
Yeah. A brief note to any of my subscribers. Please don't kill your spouse, not only because it's horrible and immoral and disgusting, but also because it doesn't have ruin your legacy in the history books. So for several reasons, please never kill your spouse. That should be the main message from this video.
Sigmund, how did I get here? I still remember the good old days when I was a boy with a heart full of fire, and Mummy would teach me. Okay, Henry, this is a horse. Can you say horse? Divorce. What? No.
Okay.
Okay, let's try this one. Can you say loaf of bread? Loaf with her head. No, Henry, that's wrong.
See where we're going, yeah.
Last one. Okay. Can you say soap? Soap. Yes, that's it. I'm the supreme head of the church. Screw the Pope. You know what?
And that basically is Henry VIII in 3 lines. I was noticing, I love the attention to detail in his videos. So they've got, I think, Power Rangers Henry VIII was playing with, and like a toy Mr. Potato Head. But also, his dolls have all had their heads cut off. And I'm sure that's deliberate, and that's some brilliant foreshadowing, or very tragic foreshadowing.
You're my son and I love you, but you're freaking weird, man.
Yes. Oversimplified Henry VIII.
The year is 1491. England has just come out of 3 decades of civil war, in which a bunch of Henrys, Edwards, and one Richard had a little ding-dong over which royal house should rule the realm. Finally... So
this was, of course, the Wars of the Roses, which were one of the big inspiration for George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. And if anyone from HBO is watching, a Wars of the Roses series would be fantastic. You can even put dragons in if you want. I mean, I'll be a bit annoyed, but not that annoyed.
Henry I, Henry VII, and he had a son. What should we name him? My royal lineage is full of Henrys. A fine name, a vigorous name, a tenacious name, a muscular name. How about Arthur?
Yes.
And so Arthur, Prince of Wales and next in line to the throne, was born. 5 years later, Prince Henry was born, but nobody cares about him. He's not the heir, just a spare. The king wanted to make an alliance with Spain, so one day he said to his son Arthur, "Hey, baby, you see that lady baby? That's going to be your wife. But father, I'm not even 3 years old yet.
Yes.
There's something you have to understand. You're my son. But more than that, you're a political bargaining tool."
Yes.
But you love me, right? I love you as a political bargaining tool. Yay.
I mean, that is genuinely how it works in the Middle Ages. Only amongst the nobility, and especially amongst royalty, the vast majority of marriages were either for political reasons or for financial reasons. Love came a very distant third.
Hey, Pop, who the heck are you? I've written you a poem. Listen here, tiny man. Can't you see that I'm busy? But I'm your son. I have another son? As Arthur was in another palace, being prepped to become king, Henry lived with his mother and 2 sisters at Eltham, where he was being trained for a church career. And not just that, Henry learnt languages. He played sports. He learnt the recorder. What a nerd. Am I right? Wrong.
That's an interesting point. I mean, obviously we have this kind of perception of Henry VIII as a brute, and he certainly became a tyrant, but he was also cultured. I mean, he was into music, he was into literature. There's a vague theory that he wrote the kind of the famous tube song Greensleeves. I mean, personally, I find it hard to believe, but I mean, the theory's out there. So yeah, he wasn't sort of a complete knucklehead.
Henry was the coolest kid around. So I told my Latin teacher he could kissius my buddiest. Anyway, here's Wonderwall.
Oh, I love Wonderwall.
Great scholars and theologians from across Europe came to meet and teach the young Prince Henry, who by all accounts was a very enlightened, bright and charming young boy. Everybody loved Henry. And out of everything Henry was taught, more than anything, he came to adore and respect theology and Catholicism. One of Henry's tutors was...
I mean, that's a supreme irony. I mean, during his early life, especially during his kind of early years as king, Henry VIII was very pro-Catholic, very pro-Pope. Obviously, things wouldn't work out that way.
English poet laureate John Skelton, who wrote a textbook for Henry that we still have today. In it, he wrote a number of important lessons for the young prince, such as, do not be mean, loathe gluttony, and do not violate widows. Important lessons for any 9-year-old boy.
Yes.
Around this time, Henry's older brother Arthur, now 15 years old, was married to Catherine of Aragon, sealing the union between England and Spain.
Hooray! Oh, not
my
so good.
alliance with Spain.
I'm getting was it Red Wedding vibes from Game of Thrones? I'll try not to make any more Game of Thrones references.
Poor alliance with Spain. And your son, sire? Oh, yes, of course, my son.
Yeah.
But mostly my alliance with Spain. Hey, Pop, who the heck are you? Oh, yeah! And just like that, an unprepared Prince Henry was now the new heir to the throne. And how about that alliance with Spain? Well, the solution was simple. Hey, boy, see that full-grown woman over there? That's gonna be your wife. What, my brother's widow? Yes. You're a freaking weirdo, man. Now, in the Bible, there's a verse that says marrying your brother's widow, that's a big no-no. So the king needed to convince the Pope and get...
And I mean, that verse will come back later when Henry is trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon. It's a little bit of foreshadowing.
His special permission. Hey, can I please have my son marry his brother's widow? Sure, why not? And so it was. Henry's life was turned on its head as he was moved to the royal court, next in line to the throne. But tragedy struck when just a few months later, his mother, with whom he was very close, suddenly died in childbirth. The loss of his mother almost certainly had a big effect.
I mean, it's crazy just how many women died in childbirth during the Middle Ages and kind of earlier periods. I mean, it makes you very, very grateful for modern medicine. It was really horrible what women had to go through.
On the young boy. In his older years, King Henry VII went on a bit of a paranoid trip. As was normal for a king at the time, Henry VII had to quell a number of rebellions, and as he aged, he became ever more suspicious of the nobility around him. To keep them in check, he began levying huge, ruinous fines, left, right, and center. Dukes, bishops, barons, even his own mother. No one was safe from his tyranny, and the nobility of England began to suffer. So when Henry VII finally got sick and died just after Christmas 1508, there was a lot of celebration.
Oh, okay.
Not only because the tyrannical Henry VII was gone, but because his replacement was the ever-popular, charming, and handsome 18-year-old King Henry VIII.
Oh, this portrayal is really interesting because obviously we have this perception of Henry VIII as a kind of gluttonous, sort of disabled, very much not mobile man. Which he certainly became, but as a young man, he was extremely athletic. He's extremely sporty, extremely into kind of the military virtues. It was only later that he became the stereotype that we tend to associate him with.
Henry married Catherine of Aragon in June 1509. You may be wondering, if it's so weird to marry your brother's widow, and since he's now king, couldn't Henry just decide not to? Well, yes, he could, but by now, Henry wanted to. The thing about Henry that was unlike many kings of the time was he married for love, and he'd grown quite fond of Catherine, very fond. Historians say their marriage was unusually good, and so he was coronated king. And what a king.
Husband points at Henry VIII. You can't say that sentence very often.
Compared to his tyrannical father, he was an absolute joy. Having the blood of 2 royal houses, he was widely supported. He was really, really ridiculously good looking, and those famous calves could achieve world peace. Hey Henry, now that you're king, you know what that means. Costume party! Henry pranced around the palace playing dress up with his friends. He wrote plays. He sang songs. He dance. A true Renaissance man, very different from the gluttonous wife killer we think of today.
Yeah.
In his early reign, people from near and far would come to ask favors of the generous king. Hey man, could I gain ownership of some land near Upton Snodsbury? Sure thing, pal. Hey.
I love the American satire on British place names. Although, in fairness, Upton Snodsbury is almost certainly a real place, and I should probably not get too carried away on that one.
Could I be an earl or a baron or a viscount or something? Anything you want, man. Could I get, just a really cool pig that has, freaking metal wings and 8 legs and shoots flipping lasers and it can grow more pigs out of it for extra pigs? Say no more. Hey, guys, I was just checking up on the financial report and what the hell? We can't afford this. Henry's council that he inherited from his father weren't happy with all the money he was just throwing around, and they worked hard to curb the king's spending. Since they controlled the royal seals needed to get stuff done, at first they were largely able to control the young king. And for Henry, the most infuriating things of all was they wouldn't let him joust with his friends because it was too dangerous, nor would they let him do the thing he wanted most, to go on a great, glorious, and expensive conquest against England's historic enemy, France.
Yeah.
Please, guys, I'll keep...
So this was after the end of the 100 Years' War, but the kings of England still also claimed the throne of France. And that there was a lot of... England's holdings in France had been pushed back just to Calais. But there was a strong desire to kind of roll that back a bit and to retake territory and eventually to take the French throne.
Now, where were we? Oh yeah, sexy calves, excessive spending, and war with France. Henry wanted glory. He wanted to go down in history. If he didn't go to war in France, was he even the King of England?
Good point.
Man, I want to go to war so bad.
If you're watching Boris Johnson, I'm sure you are. Are you even British Prime Minister if you don't go to war with France?
But the council won't
So, please don't. I'd be terrible at fighting.
let me. Hey, maybe I can help with that. Whoa, it's Cardinal Wolsey, one of my best friends. Despite being an old-ass man, Cardinal Wolsey knew that if he helped King Henry, there'd likely be something in it for him. So what was his great, intricate plan to curb the council's power? You're the king, dum-dum. You can do whatever you want.
Yes.
What? Wolsey began writing bills that simply didn't require the seals, and thus Henry was back on top. For his efforts, Wolsey began to climb the ranks, and he became something of a yes-man for King Henry, encouraging Henry to frolic and play while Wolsey took care of business.
You can see how that worked for Cardinal Wolsey. He does the kind of the affairs of the kingdom, and he's more than happy for Henry VIII to go off and get drunk and hunt or whatever. You can see why he'd be happy with that arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of makes him the true power.
Hey, kid, you want to go on an adventure? Do I ever? The Pope was at war with France and he needed some help. He offered the young, impressionable King Henry 100 Parmesan cheeses, some wine, and a golden rose if he came to the Pope's aid, and Henry was all in.
Yes.
At this point in his life, he still respected the church and loved the Pope. And here was the chance for war he had been waiting for. He still didn't have...
This is the crazy thing. Henry VIII went from literally going to war for the Pope. Admittedly, he had his own reasons as well. But from going to war for the Pope, for Catholicism, to turning against it completely. For largely personal reasons rather than theological reasons.
Have an heir, a fairly big problem for a monarch at the time. But right now, the only kind of smashing he was interested in was smashing French guys.
Yes.
And so off he went. The English already held the French city of Calais. From there, Henry made a glorious victory at the Battle of the Spurs. He took the French cities of Terouanne and Tournai. Word of his victory spread. This was it. Here was the glory he had been waiting for. Back home, his beautiful wife also led armies to victory in Scotland. And better yet, she was pregnant. Soon...
Wow, can you imagine that? You go out of the country and your pregnant wife rides into battle and defeats the enemy. How impressed would you be?
Henry would have an heir. All of Henry's wildest dreams were coming true. Oh, he ran out of money. As the French prepared to invade Italy, all Henry could do was go home. Well, at least now I have an heir to cheer me up. Bring me my son. Henry, this is Mary. Mary? That's a funny name for a boy. Henry, it's a girl.
Ooh.
This was Catherine's 5th pregnancy that had not resulted in a male heir. Happy Henry wasn't so happy anymore. You still haven't given me a male heir. Well, how do you know it's my problem? Maybe it's your problem, Henry. It couldn't be my problem because I've been boinking half your maidstaff and one of them gave me a boy. Sure. Yeah, you know what?
Yes.
Maybe it's my problem.
That's also true. In the Middle Ages, monarchs generally had mistresses, often several of them. And often because they married for political reasons. It was one of their mistresses would be kind of their true love, or their They might cycle through different true loves, but that would be the more genuine romantic element.
I'll look into that. Cardinal Wolsey, now Henry's Lord Chancellor, knew his job depended on keeping Henry happy, and so he said, well, if you can't be the great warrior, then how about the great peacemaker? Not as cool, but okay. And so the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a glamorous peace summit between England and France, was held. The King of France, Francis I, was essentially the French version of King Henry.
He even looks like Henry.
One giant codpiece measuring contest. The two sides did agree to a peace treaty.
So this took place in northern France. And it was almost like a sort of combination between like a diplomatic convention and the Olympics. There was a lot of sports competitions going on, and also kind of political discussions. But Henry VIII got heavily involved, and there's a bit of dispute about this. According to French sources, Henry VIII and the French king wrestled, and the French king won. But there's no English sources to mention this, so it's a little bit unclear whether it happened. But I mean, just how crazy would that be? It would be like Joe Biden going and having a wrestling match with Xi Jinping at an international summit, or like Boris Johnson with Putin. Or actually Boris Johnson with Putin. I think I could just about imagine that. But yeah, it was crazy how diplomacy was done.
However, it didn't last long. You see, there was a third major player in European politics at the time, an exquisite specimen of royal inbreeding, an heir to a huge inheritance, and a chin that could hit a home run.
Yes.
Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He was Henry's wife's nephew. Henry had helped him out in the past to put down a Spanish rebellion, and now the two wanted to make an alliance, and so a marriage was arranged. Mary, I'd like to introduce you to your 22-year-old fully grown adult cousin, and now your future husband. Ew, he looks inbred. Mary! We're all inbred. With their new alliance, Charles and Henry agreed
I mean, that's just objectively true. You can't argue with it.
to team up and relaunch a campaign against France. In 1522, the English landed and stormed as far south as Agincourt, but Charles didn't commit significant forces. Whoops, sorry man, not sure what happened. I'll join in next year. The next year, England swept northern France, almost taking Paris. But once again, where was Charles? Oh man, I'm so sorry. I promise, next year, I'll be there. The next year came, and a fed-up Henry decided he was going to sit this one out.
Can't blame the
Charles
guy.
ravaged the French at the Battle of Pavia and captured the French king. Holy crap, dude. Yeah, I totally kicked France's butt. That's great. So, can I have the French throne like we agreed? No. What? And also, I don't want to marry your ugly daughter anymore.
Ooh.
Ugly? Have you seen your chin? Mummy says it's a strong chin for a
So, I mean, the reason kings of England also claim the French throne, it goes all the way back to the Angevins. I mean, it really goes all the way back to Norman Conquest, but the Norman Conquest essentially intertwined the French and what would become the English royal bloodlines. And as a result, for sort of 400 years or so, England spent heavily entangled in conflicts, either with France or on what is now French territory.
strong boy. As Henry's alliance with Charles fell apart, Henry knew his days as a warrior were over. This was a problem for Henry, but it was a bigger problem for his wife. Catherine of Aragon had two jobs. The first was to give Henry a male heir, but the second was to maintain an alliance with her relatives in Spain,
Sure.
including her nephew. She had failed, and Henry's sexy eyes began to wander. Home from all his wars, Henry ate up his daily 5,000 calories of meat as an infatuation began to grow for one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Beautiful, intelligent, cultured. She was exactly Henry's type. Now, Henry had had dozens of mistresses, including Anne's sister, but
Oh, God, that's awful. I wonder if Anne knew about it. I presume she did. God, imagine that.
Anne didn't want to just be Henry's side chick. She
No.
wanted to be his queen. Henry sent dozens of letters, thirsty love poems. In one, he proclaimed that he would like to kiss her pretty ducky. Henry's loins were on fire, but
I might have to make a note of that one. God.
Anne kept him at just the right distance to
It's like
drive
sort of sexting in the 16th century.
him crazy and push him to find a way to get rid of his current wife. Wolsey, I want a divorce. And as the representative of the Pope here in England, I expect you to sort it out quickly and quietly. I don't want this to turn into a Europe-wide scandal. You
Fair
got it,
enough.
Your Majesty. Hey, Big Papa! My boy Henry says he wants to divorce his wife. Any chance? To Henry's shock and horror, Wolsey deferred the case back to the Pope in Rome. To make matters worse, after all the wars in Europe, the Pope was currently under the thumb of Charles V. Now everybody knew what was going on, and Henry's divorce trial had become a pawn of greater European politics. For Wolsey, the decision was a disaster. His job was to keep Henry happy, and Henry was very, very unhappy. Nevertheless, the divorce trial began. Henry's case rested upon the Bible verse in Leviticus that claimed marrying your brother's widow would lead to childlessness.
Yes, as we heard earlier, this is coming back to the argument that was used against Henry marrying her in the first place is now being used by Henry to try and divorce her.
And Henry was certainly having a hard time getting a male heir. He argued that the Pope had got it wrong when he allowed Henry to marry his brother's widow, and that now divorce was the only solution. However, the Pope and Charles V acquired some interesting letters from an unknown source. He wants to kiss her pretty duckies? Man, this guy's loins are on fire. The Pope now knew the case for divorce may not actually be found in Henry's Bible, but in Henry's pants. After escaping Charles V, the Pope did send out one Cardinal Campeggio to oversee the trial. Campeggio was an old man racked with gout. It took him 6 painful months to travel from Rome to England, and when he finally got there, this kept happening. Hey, I need you to take a look at this evidence. I can't. My gout is acting up. Hey, are you ready to take my testimony? I can't. My gout is acting up. Hey, can you please make a decision? I can't. Your gout is acting up? My gout.
I'm going to have to use that excuse. Why haven't you done your work? My gout was acting up. According to this, if it's good enough for a cardinal, it's good enough for me. I'll give it a go.
Gout is acting up. Anne Boleyn, with her Protestant views in support of the Reformation, suspected the Pope was just delaying. For 2 whole years, the trial dragged on, and in the end, the Pope simply said, no, no divorce for you. Henry, the king that had previously defended the Pope militarily from France and intellectually from the reformist ideas of Martin Luther, who had once respected the Pope above all, now found the Pope standing between him and fourth base. Your Majesty,
yes.
What will you do? I'm the king, dum-dum. I can do whatever I want. What? For his failure, Henry removed Wolsey from the court, a decision that was likely influenced by Anne Boleyn, who disliked the cardinal. Having fallen from grace and with potential charges of treason over his head, Wolsey died of illness a year later. Then, Henry set about removing England from the influence of the Pope. Hey, if you do...
So, an important context here is obviously the Protestant Reformation, which began in Germany, was beginning to get some supporters in England. So there were some people in England who wanted to break with the Church anyway, with the Catholic Church. And that gave Henry VIII sort of potential allies to work with. Thomas Cromwell, for example, who became one of Henry VIII's really his closest advisor, he was always a bit suspicious of the influence of the Catholic Church. That being said, of course, Henry VIII's reason for switching sides wasn't theological, it was political/personal.
That, I'll excommunicate you. Who cares, man? Oh no, apathy, my weakness. Henry gathered theologians and scholars together to help him make his case against the Pope. Together, they argued to the people of England that the Pope's rule over the Church was basically a takeover of what had once been a self-governing, national English Church. And if that sounds familiar, some historians do believe this moment may have laid the foundations for English Euroscepticism. That's right. Brexit may have been influenced by Henry's explosive loins. By and large, the people...
I love that argument. I'm going to make a note of that and use it more often in conversation.
Will give Henry their support, and those that didn't were going to be in for a rough time. But for now, Henry assumed the role.
So one of those who was killed famously, I guess we'll probably get onto this, was Sir Thomas More, who was a very famous Catholic theologian. He was actually made into a saint eventually by the Catholic Church after his execution. But he was a fervent intellectual, but he was also involved in torturing Protestant dissenters. But he refused to go along this. As far as Catholics were concerned, this is heresy. The Pope is the head of the Church. Henry VIII declaring himself head of the Church is heresy. And obviously a lot of Catholics were executed as a result of them holding that view.
Of supreme head of the English Church, and his next divorce trial was a foregone conclusion. Catherine of Aragon was Aragon, and Anne Boleyn was in. Alright, I've upended the entire country to be with you, so you'd better give me a son, okay? Now, did you get my letter about the duchess? Having finally married the girl of his dreams, it was party time for Henry. And what a party. Life in the Tudor court was non-stop, huge banquets, with each person eating on average 5,000 calories a day, and no vegetables. Those are for poor people. Rich people ate meat. And so you know what else is for rich people? Constipation. But don't let that stop the party. The toilets are communal. And
Oh
Henry
my
himself
God.
was the...
Oh, yeah, that it sounds like a music festival. That's the only comparison I can think of is music festival toilets, and you do not want to go near music festival toilets. They're horrible.
center of everything. He ate the best food. He had 1,200 pairs of shoes. He didn't even have to wipe his own bum bum. Life was great.
Really?
Everyone...
Can you imagine if like the present queen went along with that, like refused to wipe her own arse, or even the prime minister? I mean, I'd almost be tempted as a power play. I mean, I wouldn't actually. I'd like stop it when the paper was coming towards me, just to see if anyone would.
I give you your majesty, King Henry VIII. But how did they pay for it all? Well, influenced by his fairly Protestant new wife, since Henry had overturned the organization of the church, this is how they paid for it. Oh my goodness, how awful. Selling fake fragments of the cross? Vials of Jesus' blood that you got from a duck? Using religion in this way? This is terrible. I must confiscate all this money at once. Yes, how awful. I must take all of this away immediately. Monasteries across the nation were dissolved and their riches placed in the royal coffers.
I mean, a huge amount of kind of cultural damage took place. I mean, a lot of early records of English history were destroyed. A huge amount of documents of sort of place of historical importance got damaged during the dissolution of the monasteries.
Obviously, many people weren't too happy about this, but Henry had a plan for that as well.
Yeah.
Henry's descent into tyranny had begun, as any who rejected his new claim as supreme head of the English church found their heads on the chopping block. And so Henry partied. He danced, he sang, he ate, he jousted.
Ooh. Nasty.
Be me. Love gluttony. Violate widows.
Yes.
In 1536, Henry fell from his horse in a jousting accident. Not for the first time, but certainly the heaviest fall he had taken yet. Some historians believe the brain damage caused by the incident may have violently accelerated Henry's descent into tyranny. Executions in England ramped up. During his reign, it's estimated 57 to 72,000 people were put to death.
I mean, this is important. In England, Henry VIII's daughter, Mary I, who became the monarch after him. Well, not straight after him. His son was very briefly monarch, but then died. But Mary is known as Bloody Mary. That's kind of her unofficial nickname because she tried to avert the country to Catholicism, and she killed a lot of Protestants, particularly by burning them. But the number she killed was nothing like as many as Henry VIII killed, and it shows you just how much terror Henry VIII had to use to overcome the Catholic Church, to make himself head of the new Church of England. How much violence that process involved.
Rich or poor, big or small, no one was safe. And the most prominent victim of all was to be Henry's own wife. It had been 3 years since their marriage. Anne had been pregnant 4 times, yet she had only been able to produce one healthy child, a girl. What's more, it's possible she had been going around insulting Henry's manhood. Henry's eyes, once again, began to wander. His new top man, Thomas Cromwell, didn't want to end up like Cardinal Wolsey, and so he came up with a plan. There was a court musician who had been quite...
There's a really good TV series on kind of the politics of Henry VIII's court around this time with Anne Boleyn called Wolf Hall. It's based on a really good book. So check it out. Wolf Hall is a BBC series. Quite short.
With the Queen. Well, Thomas Cromwell and his boys got a forced confession out of him, saying that it didn't stop at innocent flirtation, and the charges came rolling in. Listen, Anne, we need to talk. Oh no, you're going to divorce me, aren't you? Just like your last wife. Aw, no, come here. Shh, no, I'm not going to divorce you. It's much worse than that.
Yes.
Anne was charged with adultery, perversion, even incest, and plotting to kill the king himself. The jury found her guilty, including her own uncle and ex-fiancé, both fearing the wrath of the king. And on May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was Anne Boleyn. Literally the next day, Henry married one of Anne's...
That's indecent. The next day, my God. At least leave like a couple of weeks.
...waiting, Jane Seymour, his third wife. After Anne had smack-talked his manhood, and since he still had no male heir, Henry went on a campaign to ensure the public knew he was as virile as it gets. He had this famous portrait painted of the manliest man I've ever seen, and later he would even have his physician make a declaration about his health. King Henry is a fine specimen of a man, and please don't make me say this. Say it. And every time I look at him, I wish I were the one. The truth is, after his jousting accident, the king had badly injured his leg and was no longer very active, yet he was still eating his daily 5,000 calories. So by now, Henry was extremely unhealthy for the remainder of his life.
And this is kind of the Henry VIII we tend to think of in sort of popular culture or the popular perception. Very different from what he was as a young man.
He would incur a number of illnesses, and his injured leg ulcers would ooze stinking pus.
Oh.
A fine specimen of a man indeed. On the church front, Henry's new and now pregnant wife was a devout Catholic, and she pleaded with the king to reinstate the monasteries. Henry was sick of wives meddling in his business, and he bluntly warned her to remember what happened to Anne Boleyn. Since splitting with the Pope, Henry had been hard at work determining the theology of his new Church of England. It kept many Catholic traditions, while on the other hand embracing some reformist ideas, such as requiring the use of a new Bible, not in Latin, but in English.
So, I mean, the kind of the full move, I mean, Henry VIII started England's move down the road to Protestantism, but it was really completed during the reign of his son and Elizabeth I. I mean, during Henry VIII's time, the Anglican Church still had quite a lot of Catholic stuff about it. I mean, although some hardline Protestant sects argue that the Church of England is still too Catholic even to this day. So, that's a topic for, well, probably not for another video because it's very boring. That's a topic for someone else.
The cover of Henry's new Bible depicted the people appearing to worship a giant King Henry. And in the corner, there's some people being put to death, just for good measure.
Yeah.
And
this is key. So even to this day, the monarch of England is also the head of the Church of England. So Queen Elizabeth II is not only the Queen of the United Kingdom and lots of other countries, she's also the head of the Church of England, i.e. God's appointed representative on earth, according to Anglicans. And this this is one of the reasons why there are lots of restrictions on Catholics marrying into the royal family. I mean, until very recently, there were restrictions on divorcees marrying into the royal family. That's the problem Wallace Simpson had, because that was seen as a kind of an insult to God to have the head of the Church of England married to a divorcee.
Any who opposed Henry's ideas, whether Catholic or Protestant, for any who rebelled against him, it would be off with their heads.
Yeah.
In October 1537, Henry finally got what he had been waiting for. His wife Jane gave birth to a healthy boy. However, the triumph soon turned to tragedy, as Jane Seymour died days later from complications during the birth. Henry mourned Jane, the woman who had given him a son, for 2 years.
Horrible.
Your Majesty, it's time to choose your next wife. Thomas! Not now! Can't you see I'm in mourning? That one. The woman Thomas Cromwell had lined up for Henry's next marriage was the sister of a powerful German duke. But all Henry cared about was that she was pretty as pie. And Thomas Cromwell promised that indeed she was. However, when she arrived in England, Henry was less than pleased. Your Majesty, let me introduce you to your fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. What's that smell? I think it's your leg, sire. No, it's Anne of Cleves. She's ugly. This is treason. What? Off with his head.
There's a story that when Henry VIII first met Anne of Cleves, he dressed up in peasant's clothing. So the idea being that she would sort of identify his beauty even through the sort of fake common clothes he was wearing. But she was just repulsed. As far as she was concerned, some random fat peasant was hitting on her. I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly a great story.
Henry found his new
and then he was very offended by her being repulsed, obviously.
So repulsive that he never consummated the marriage and divorced her just 6 months later. And for bringing Henry an ugly, stinky woman, along with additional charges of plotting treason, Thomas Cromwell lost his head. The very same day of Cromwell's execution, Henry married his fifth wife, the famed beauty.
Seriously, he's not he's got no kind of common decency, has he? He's like execution, wedding. One follows the other.
Catherine Howard. She's believed to have only been 17 at the time. Henry was 49. And like Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard...
I mean, again, obviously that sounds disgusting to us, and indeed it kind of is. But in the Middle Ages, you had much, much worse matches than that.
Didn't last long. You see, for some reason, she may not have been entirely satisfied with her 49-year-old fine specimen of a man, and it's possible she engaged in a number of extramarital affairs, including one with her cousin, Thomas Culpeper. When Henry found out, he was devastated. How could she do this to me? But, sire, don't you have hundreds of mistresses? Shut up, Barry. That's not the point. Your Majesty, You're crying. I'm not crying. It's just that sometimes, when I get sad, water comes out of my eyes! For her treason, Catherine Howard met the same fate as Anne Boleyn in 1542.
Yeah.
So, we've had divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, look out, here comes survived. Henry married the daughter of a royal official, Catherine Parr, in 1543, and she appears to have been...
Can you imagine being a royal official? Like, you're giving away your daughter to the King of England, which is fantastic. But he's already executed 2 previous wives and divorced 2 previous wives. So what are her chances? You'd have such mixed feelings.
Been a good companion to Henry. She cared for the aging king, who by now was so heavy it took several men to winch him onto his horse. She acted as a mediator within the family and convinced the king to restore his 2 daughters to the line of succession.
And this is of course crucial, because if Mary and Elizabeth hadn't been restored to royal succession, I've no idea who would have become king after Henry's son. It would have been someone completely different.
She did have one hiccup, however, when Catherine dared disagree with the king over the subject of theology. It's a miracle, because when the priest says the words of institution, the bread turns into the body of Christ. Well, if you put the bread in a box for 3 months, is it a miracle that it turns moldy? Treason! You can't just call everything treason, Henry. The king called for her arrest, as serious charges were placed over her head. However, in the end, she told Henry that she had not been disagreeing with him, but simply learning from him. And so when the guards came to arrest her, the king told them to make like an Anne and cleave. Catherine Parr stayed with Henry right until the end. As he aged into his later years, in increasing pain and ill health, he grew ever more suspicious and moody. The once generous, promising young king was now feared by all around him. Sigmund, I don't have much longer. Hold me. Of course, sire. Do you have any final wishes? How about one last conquest in France? And so in 1544, Henry made for Calais. The pesky French had been supporting the Scottish in their ongoing wars with England, and they also owed Henry some money. So the extremely unhealthy king personally led a siege against the French city of Boleyn.
I mean, I've got like a bit of kudos to the guy for at least trying. Like, if I was seriously ill and approaching the end of my life, conquering France would not be the top of my list.
The English dug tunnels under the castle, and on the 13th of September, the French surrendered. A glorious victory for Henry. In actuality, the whole misadventure nearly bankrupted England, and they ended up giving Boulogne back to the French a few years later.
Yes.
But shh, don't tell Henry. He's having his moment. Finally, in 1547, a 55-year-old Henry, lapsing in and out of consciousness, passed away.
Wow.
His son, Edward, succeeded him, but died just 5 years later. His daughter, Mary, briefly took the reins and steered the country back towards the Pope. But then his second daughter embraced reformist ideas and gradually transformed England into a Protestant country. Henry's desperation to marry Anne Boleyn and his resulting feud with the Pope had changed the course of English history and religion forever. Unfortunately, none of Henry's children had heirs, and when Elizabeth I died, Henry's lineage ended, with the House of Stuart replacing the House of Tudor.
Yeah.
So then you might think, all that effort, a life filled with so much frustration, yet he never conquered France, he barely had a male heir, and his lineage died out. The egotistical man Henry grew sick and cruel, and then died. So why are we all so fascinated with King Henry VIII? Why not Henry II or IV? Well, without mentioning the many important things his reign did achieve, one of his biggest goals was to go down in history, and you can put a big green check beside that one. Because everything he did, and how he asserted his control and authority over everyone around him, has come to be viewed as the epitome of the word king. And also because of the wife killings? Yeah, definitely the wife killings.
Yes. No, that was really well done. But I mean, it's hard to overstate just how big a deal the English Reformation was. So for hundreds of years, England was completely loyal to the Catholic Church, or almost completely loyal, or almost always completely loyal to the Catholic Church. And suddenly to have one of the main powers of Europe break away was a huge blow for the Pope. And of course, England would go on to spread its version of Protestantism all around the world via the British Empire later on. So if England had stayed Catholic, you can reasonably assume that the British Empire would have spread Catholic ideas. And nowadays, kind of Catholicism and Christianity would be far more synonymous than they are. Whereas, of course, in our day, Catholicism, whilst it's probably the single most important branch of Christianity, is just one branch. But anyway, I hope you found that interesting. I found that really interesting. Please do like, subscribe, leave a comment, say if you agree with me about the importance of the Reformation, and hope to see you for another video.